seat where every board, in addition to ESG and risk and strategy, cybersecurity issues, and how to embed it in the governance operating systems is being discussed. So that's a big shift which Indian boards and Indian corporate governance framework is finding. Professor Bhagat has more than decades of experience working with venture capital funds, private for-profit companies, and public non-profit companies in US. He has advised the US Security Exchange Commission (SEC), which is a counterpart of our Security Exchange Board of India, and the US Department of Treasury on corporate finance and corporate governance matters. He has a long-standing contribution in the field of academics by way of writing illustrious, and scholarly articles, I must say, the research papers, and very well known in the corporate governance circles, specifically in the US and globally, and that's what influenced us as well, reaching out to him, and he's so kind and gentle, accepted our request. So the bio is too long, Professor Bhagat. I would like it to be there in your discourse while sharing your experiences and perspectives that people should know about your engagements. I will not stand between you and the group. A very warm welcome again. Good morning to you. You are taking pains, taking out time in the morning. It's 4:15 here. So over to you, Professor Bhagat. I'm very excited to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very kind introduction. And I thank the Ministry of Corporate Affairs for organizing this. Let's start with this discussion. What should be the objective of a company or a corporation? The famous American Nobel Prize economist Milton Friedman, he said that basically the company should maximize the long-term shareholder value while adhering to the laws of the land. The emphasis is on long-term, which is often ignored in the media. And then the company has to follow all the labor laws, environmental laws. So within that framework, they are supposed to maximize the value of the shareholders. The alternate viewpoint that has been made very popular today is what's known as stakeholderism. The idea is that companies should give way to the well-being of stakeholders as independent objectives. Now, who are these stakeholders? They are the company's customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and then they talk about long-term shareholder value. So this has become this emphasis on stakeholderism has acquired international focus. So you have the World Economic Forum that meets every February in Davos, Switzerland. They're very big on this stakeholderism concept. In India, almost every month or at least every other month, there's a major conference on CSR that stands for Corporate Social Responsibility, or ESG that stands for Environment, Social Justice, and Governance. They mean similar things, though they sound different, CSR, ESG. So it's a big item of discussion in India also. And in the US, the Business Roundtable and other groups, the American Law Institute, they also are talking a lot and holding conferences and meetings about how to incorporate stakeholderism, are we doing the right thing, and so forth. And if you see that I kind of have these red dots here, meaning there are many more venues across the world, especially in Europe, that talk about stakeholderism. And once I'm looking at the number of conferences, the number of meetings that are emphasizing CSR and ESG, I'm reminded about the saying from an old Bollywood movie that some of you might recall, where one individual there said that राशन पे भाषण बहुत है, लेकिन भाषण पे राशन नहीं है. Okay, so let me give you a context to understand both shareholder value and stakeholderism in one consistent framework. So, if you're talking about shareholder value, I'm hoping that you can see these slides and read what I have in them. So, in shareholder value, the company managers are supposed to be looking at the interest of employees, customers, suppliers, communities, environment. So they're not ignoring that, but they're looking at all of these issues through the prism or the lens of shareholder value. So that's the main essence of maximizing long-term shareholder value, is that you are looking at all these things at employees, customers, environment, communities, but you're looking at them through this lens, the prism of shareholder value. In this stakeholderism concept, you're looking at all of these things independently. So that's the main difference, that you're supposed to be looking at these things independently. How much weight you give to each of these is not clear in this new way of thinking about the corporate objective. So what are the problems with stakeholderism? So one is that it is internally inconsistent. So what do I mean by it being internally inconsistent? Let's take our Prime Minister's major initiative, which I think makes a lot of sense, Make in India. So Make in India has many good aspects to it. It'll create jobs, improve manufacturing innovation, improve India's GDP growth. So all those are good things. But on the other side of the coin, manufacturing requires electric power. So let's look at India's source of power. As of December of last year, more than half of India's power came from coal and gas, and within this brown area, more than half of that is from coal. So and then you have hydro and wind and renewables here. So if we have to do more manufacturing in India, we will need more electric power, and most of the electric power, in spite of the great advances that India has made with regard to renewables like solar and wind, and all that is very good, most of the power still comes from coal and gas, and mostly coal at that. So that obviously, if you want to generate more power in India, and that's also true for most of the world, it'll have a negative environmental impact because of the emissions from burning coal, oil, or gas. So where does that take us? So if you then go and think about it, on the one hand you have jobs, and on the other hand you have environment. And in stakeholderism, you're supposed to balance these two. I mean, how exactly you go about balancing those two is not clear. If you want more jobs, you have to be prepared for more carbon emission. We can keep trying more wind and solar, and that's good, but that does not generate enough electricity in India or anywhere in most parts of the world. You have to still rely on oil and gas and coal. So how you make this trade-off is not clear, and that's one of the problems with stakeholderism. With regard to the use of electric power, there's another issue that doesn't get emphasized in this debate on ESG and CSR. That this graph basically shows that you have different countries here. India is somewhere in here. What this graph tries to emphasize is that here you have the amount of electricity that is consumed per individual, and then here is human development index. The human development index includes things like mortality rate, the how long the life expectancy is, GDP GDP per capita. So it includes all those items, and what you find is that you have more the quality of the human development improves as individuals consume more electricity. So all of you have probably heard of examples where if people don't have electricity in villages, they have to rely on other sources of power that have negative impact on their lives and on their health. So that's sort of, and this is a worldwide phenomena, especially for lower to middle income countries. And that, so the use of electricity is also um, uh, integrated with the quality of human life that doesn't get emphasized in this debate on environmentalism. The other sort of a more of a business or a finance perspective on stakeholderism is that the stakeholderism actually has become a convenient excuse for financial underperformance by managers of a company. And this is not just empty speculation. There are several papers, one of which I've written recently on green bonds. So green bonds are bonds that companies issue, and the claim is that they will use the proceeds of these bonds to invest in environmentally friendly investments in the company. Now, as I think, as most of you in corporate finance know, once a company raises money, the money goes into the corporate treasury, and it's very hard to track every rupee as to where it goes. Anyways, what we found is that companies that issue green bonds are performing poorly in a financial sense. And I have a reference there if you want to go take a look at that. Another paper, so this paper looks at the quarterly teleconferences that CEOs in the US have with analysts in the Wall Street and analysts across the globe. And what people have found is that when the CEOs of companies talk a lot about ESG and the environment and employees and communities, when they talk a lot, then their financial operating earnings are usually below expectations. On the other hand, when the company is doing very well in terms of their operating earnings, then you don't hear any talk of ESG. So this is sort of another piece of evidence that stakeholderism is actually, while the basic idea sounds good, in terms of what it's being used for, it's become excuse for financial underperformance. Now, again, to try and give some synthesis to this issues about stakeholderism and shareholder value. So let's think of everything to the right of this vertical line as, so these projects will create positive stakeholder value, meaning it is good for environment, communities, employees. How we measure that, that's another issue, but let's just defer that issue. And then everything above this horizontal line creates positive shareholder value. So now you have four quadrants. And what you find is that in these two green quadrants, there is no inconsistency between whether we use the shareholder value or the stakeholder value or stakeholderism from the corporate viewpoint or the company's viewpoint. The company will make the same decision with regard to investing in some new plant or hiring more employees, a new marketing campaign, new product. All of those decisions would be the same here. In this case, they'll do all of those things. In this case, they won't. The problem is when we are in these orange quadrants, and let's look at that a little bit more carefully. So when are we likely to be in the green quadrants? This issue has not been or rarely gets discussed in this ESG or CSR debate. Or I go to many of these conferences, I speak at many of these conferences, and almost always there is no discussion of this. The point is that if you have competitive labor markets, competitive product markets, then whether you're talking about shareholder value or stakeholder value, stakeholderism, from the company viewpoint, they end up making the same decisions. Now, why is that the case? Let's take a simple example. Now, I know that employee, labor has hard time moving around, but if you have competitive labor markets, and if managers are not treating their laborers well, their employees well, the employees have other opportunities in a competitive labor market, meaning if they have other places they can go and work. Additionally, if a company acquires the reputation of not treating their workers well, it'll have a hard time attracting good workers to begin with. So if you have a competitive labor market, managers on their own are going to treat the employees well. And they'll treat the employees well thinking about long-term shareholder value, because without good employees, you can't do anything. And then the same argument applies for good product markets. If your goods and services are not attractive to your customers, well, they have other options. So this competition is a very important aspect that will address this debate between shareholder value and ESG, but doesn't get emphasized. However, there is some merit to the concerns about ESG, but those merits have to do again when you do not have competitive labor markets and product markets. And competition is something that national governments in all the countries can do something about. So if you find that some companies are acting monopolistically, or some industries are acting as a oligopoly, that's something that the country government can do something about. So this is one of the issues that I think is a way to think about resolving shareholder value and stakeholder values. The other problem that really needs emphasis, and I think this is where I sympathize with those that talk about ESG, but they don't talk in this exact way, that if managers or the owners of a company have differential time horizons from, say, the communities they operate in. For example, there are some environmental damages that a company may do that may only become known after 15, 20 years after the damage has been done. If that is the case, then by that time the manager has already retired and resigned, and there's nothing to be done there. That's a real problem. And then with regard to risk exposure, shareholders are only thinking about non-diversifiable risk. If managers have to focus on the entire risk of the company, but the communities and the employees that are hired by the company, they have to think of the total risk. If the company goes bankrupt, the employees lose jobs, relocation is costly. So that issue, the employees face more risk, communities face more risk. Some of these issues can be addressed with appropriately structured compensation of CEOs of the company, managing directors of the company. I have a whole book on this topic as to how you design effective incentive compensation that gets the managers to think about the long term. But that's a real issue, though we don't quite hear this discussion in that. So we've talked a lot about ESG. Now let me give you some specifics as to what we are talking about. The environment has a lot of items in it, like waste, hazardous material. That's the one that gets talked about. Energy consumption, fresh water consumption, supply chain, social justice. Employee hiring, promotion practices, diversity, consumer rights, disclosure and labeling, health safety of employees, and communities in which these companies are operating it. And then you have the more traditional governance that includes board independence, board diversity, board compensation, executive compensation, shareholder voting rights. So the issue of ESG has received a lot of focus across the world, as we talked about. And here is Morningstar's data on the amount of new funds that are coming in every quarter. So this is the, these are the assets under management every quarter going up through last year. And most of the action is in Europe, which is in light blue. The dark blue or this dark green color, that's for US, and this yellow is rest of the world. So this actual emphasis on investing in ESG companies. So you have mutual funds across the globe. You have mutual funds in India, in Europe, in the US. And these mutual funds are emphasizing their investment in companies that claim to be more sensitive to their employees and environment, ESG. And as you can see, there is a lot of money involved here. We're talking about $2.5 trillion. And there's been a recent paper in the Journal of Finance here in the US that looks at how investors respond to mutual funds that are investing in these ESG companies that emphasize ESG. And in March of 2016, Morningstar, that is the most highly reputed company that provides a lot of data to investors across the globe on mutual funds across the globe. So they started rating mutual funds from 5 globe to 1 globe. 5 globe I have in green, meaning 5 globe funds are, very much sensitive to ESG, environment, social justice, governance concerns. 1 globe funds are sort of, not that sensitive about environmental issues and other ESG issues. So they gave this label, and after they gave this label, so this is from 2016 to the end of that year, this blue line shows that investors started putting a lot of money into these 5 globe funds, and the 1 globe funds did not do as well in terms of, new investor funds. So that's all good. Investors, said, okay, Morningstar is saying these are 5 globe funds that are focused on ESG. So investors like that. That's all very good. The real question is, how did these funds do in terms of their financial returns? And basically, if you're looking at stock returns, especially over the long horizon, by long horizon, I mean 6 months, 9 months, and thereafter, and longer than that, measuring abnormal performance over long horizons is a pretty tricky issue. But that notwithstanding, these authors are professionals in this. What they find is that no matter what benchmark you use, these 5 globe funds that are these ESG sensitive funds, they always underperform the 1 globe funds. So on the financial measure, these 1 globe funds are doing much better. Excuse me. That's just one paper. There's another paper that recently also came out. It got written up in The Economist. And this talks about United Nations. Back in 2006, United Nations, launched their principles of responsible investment. It has a lot of the ESG flavor to it, and I've written down those 6 principles. Basically, it says, let's look at number 1. We will incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis and decision making. So essentially, if you are a mutual fund and you sign on to this United Nations PRI principles, you are saying that you will adhere with these ESG focused investments in companies that you invest in. So all this sounds very good. It sounds like, mutual funds are trying to do the right thing. The United Nations is trying to, do the right thing. Again, you sort of go and look at the returns of funds that emphasize PRI and funds that don't talk about that as much. And what the authors found, at least for US institutional investors, that the US institutional investors, while they may talk about signing on to the United Nations principles of responsible investment, there really is no follow up on that. They're not investing in companies that are environmentally focused or focused on ESG. And additionally, what they find is that there is this evidence of greenwashing, that mutual funds that are signing on to the United Nations PRI principles typically have not been doing so well, similar to what we showed you earlier for individual companies. And then also with regard to the financial performance, the funds that are signing on to the UN principles of responsible investment principles, their returns are lower and their risk is higher. So basically, to summarize what we've been talking about so far, managers talk about stakeholderism when their financial performance is poor. Mutual funds that are most focused on sustainability have poor investment performance. And then you have the negative consequences of environmentalism that doesn't get emphasized enough, especially for a country like India. It has a negative impact on jobs and negative impact on the quality of human lives. Okay, so with that, let's turn the focus a little bit more closely to what's happening in India, especially with regard to the Companies Act of 2013 that got passed by the Lok Sabha in December of 2012 and the Rajya Sabha in August of 2013. So Section 135 of this Companies Act requires companies that are above some size that they must have a CSR board committee on their corporate board. So what is this board committee supposed to do? It's supposed to formulate and publicize their CSR policies. And it has to spend 2% of the company's profits on CSR activities. So you might say, well, that's all very good. Companies looking after, employees and customers and environment and communities. Well, that's what could go wrong. Well, one of the things that did go wrong is that as this law was passed, the stock market in India did not like that too much. Stock prices of companies that were forced to spend money on CSR that went down. And this is a very carefully done study by two scholars, one at the Indian School of Business and another here in the US. It's a very carefully done study. And more to the point, this is so what we're looking at here. Let me kind of go over this graph. So in the blue bars, you're looking at so we have buckets here going from 0% investment or expenditure in CSR activities, expenditures between 0% to 1% of the profits. So these groups are based on pre-Section 135 spending. So here we have 9 different buckets so this is 0, meaning these companies spent no money in CSR activities before Section 135. These companies spend between 0% to 1, from here 1 to 2, from here 2 to 3, etc. And then these companies spent a lot on CSR, because this blue graph indicates that there were companies in India before Section 135 that were already spending a lot more on CSR than what Section 130 required. And there were companies that were spending a little bit less. So we have examples, many examples of companies in India that were spending a lot more than 2% of their profits before Section 135 got passed. And after 135 got passed, companies that weren't spending anything, they had to up their expenditures. Ultimately, this will have to go to 2 unless these companies get, otherwise there will be, I guess, legal implications for these companies. But they are moving in the right direction. Companies that were spending between 2 to 3% of their profits, they stayed at that level. Companies that were spending between 3 to 4% of their profits before the pre-section, they decreased their expenditures on CSR. So after Section 135 got passed, companies that were spending more than 2% of their profits, and indeed there was several hundred companies that were doing that, several hundred large companies that were doing that, they lowered their corporate social responsibility expenditures down to the legally required 2%. And that issue has not been highlighted enough, that when you pass a law, yes, there are some companies that started to now spend more on CSR, but there are companies that are now spending less on CSR. So because now earlier CSR was viewed as voluntary activity by the company thought, okay, we have to act responsibly toward the community, the environment, and they would spend some amount of the profit. In fact, you find some companies were spending a lot more than 2% of the profits. After the law got passed, the way that managing directors look at CSR activity is like a tax. It's compliance. So now if it's compliance, well, let's comply, and they're all complying right at the legally required 2% of their profits. So, while the law was passed with good faith, trying to have companies focus on employees and communities, environment, the impact may sort of be quite the opposite in some cases, or in many cases here. Now, with regard to the specifics, as to what board members should actually be doing with regard to CSR. So one is this, first I've tried to break CSR activities, meaning up to 2% of corporate profits, and then more than 2%, and I will get to that in a minute. Since legally the company is required to spend 2% of their profits on CSR activities, though I think that law was misguided, that nonetheless, how should company be thinking about? So you have various CSR expenditures. These 4 get most of the CSR funds from most companies: community welfare, education, environment, healthcare. So one is that the company, the board, the CSR committee, they should avoid ad hoc decisions. What that means is there has to be a deliberate process that the company has gone through, the CSR committee has gone through, and they get input from a variety of stakeholders, especially the employees. That's very critical in today's world, especially critical in a country like India. You have to get the input from your employees as to where these funds should be spent. It doesn't mean that you do exactly what they're saying, but you really have to pay a lot of attention to what the employees are saying. And then the CSR expenditures, they have to be consistent with the company's value. If the company is talking about that we will, try to avoid issues with regard to race or caste, well then, you cannot go out on, or religion, then you cannot go out and spend all of your CSR resources on people from some caste or racial background or religious background. If you're saying you treat everybody the same, there has to be some evidence of that in how the CSR funds are spent. And then you have to see that if your expenditures are going to polarize some of your stakeholders, meaning you may be able to please one set of your employees, the other set of employees will get upset by it. Not to say that, you should just never do anything like that, but you have to keep that in mind. And if some investment is very, very polarizing, then you need to avoid that. And then if you've been involved consistently in doing something, it's better, when you're talking about CSR, it's better to be consistent over the years than to try and do different things in any given year. And then you have to also treat CSR expenditures as a competitive advantage. So you have to look at your competition and see what they are doing and try to differentiate yourself from the competition on the basis of your CSR investments. The other points that the CSR committee board members who are in the audience will find relevant is when you're doing a CSR activity like healthcare for your employees or communities, you have to have a baseline, meaning you have to measure something. How do you measure the health of employees? Or if you're talking about the environmental impact, you have to have some understanding of where things stand today. And then you have to have some statement in your CSR policy as to what does success look like in 2 years, in 5 years. And now we are talking about longer terms. Longer term means that if you're talking about education or healthcare, if a company's profits are low in some year, it doesn't mean that you stop worrying about education of your employees or the employees' uh, families or the health of your employees or the health of your communities. You can't say, okay, since our profits were very low this year, we'll stop worrying about healthcare. Well, I mean that human healthcare needs attention every year. In fact, every month, every day. So even in the lean years, you have to continue those investments, even if you may have to spend more than the required 2% of your profits. And then this other issue about charity begins at home. Well, CSR is not exactly charity. I use that old sort of old phrase. You have to first think locally. So if your company is based in some geographic area, in some state, or in some city, or some rural area, you have to be thinking about doing your CSR activities mostly within that geographical neighborhood of where your company's operations are located. And then, with regard to how these funds do get invested, it's a lot better to make these investments through your own trust funds of the company rather than using the NGOs. NGOs, while they have their hearts in the right place and they mean well, they tend to be typically a lot less efficient than your own trust fund might be. And then for expenditures beyond 2% of profits. So yes, I'm saying companies can and should spend more than 2% of the profits. In fact, many companies before Section 135 were spending more than 2% of the profits in India. I would encourage those companies to continue spending more. And but again, the way you spend more is you have to look at those expenditures through this prism or the lens of shareholder value. So a company may want to spend more on their employees in terms of their compensation, benefits, so forth, more than 2% of their profits. If by doing so they can attract better employees, retain better employees, get the employees more motivated. Same with regard to the environmental issues, their communities. But all of those have to go through this lens of shareholder value. And with that, I'll pause here and address any questions that you might have. So please go ahead.
We can have the, thank you, sir, for the presentation. It's a very nice presentation. We will have the questions now from the audience. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you accordingly. Dilip, sir, Dilip Kulkarni. You can unmute and ask your question. No. Is there any question? Okay, so I think we don't have much questions now. So, sir, thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, it's very interesting that there are a lot of aspects covered and everybody has a lot of things to take from it, particularly from a public policy background. So I was so fascinated by the unintended consequences that came out of those company, that section 135, that inclusion, etc. And here we are in our center, we are doing research on innovative CSR Companies Act, etc. So it's a very wonderful thing. So sorry, we have a question from Anand Dayal. So you can mute yourself and ask the question.
Good morning, Professor Bhagat. Enjoyed your talk very much, extremely informative. My question deals with Section 135, which in India mandates, the 2%. Are there similar requirements in other jurisdictions? And what has been the experience with in other countries?
Good morning or good afternoon, Anand. Good to hear from you. India is the only major jurisdiction, major country in the world that actually has a legal requirement on CSR expenditures by companies. So that's the only country that has done that. Other countries have done something more along the lines of requiring in the Norwegian in Norway decade earlier, they required that at least a majority of their board members have to be women. In California also, they required that a majority of their board members of companies that are based in California have to be women. So when companies have announced the, or when countries or states have announced these diversity requirements in their corporate boards, the stock market has usually not appreciated these requirements. So those who are mostly diversity requirements, there has not been a sort of a monetary expenditure requirement outside of India. But as you saw, with the evidence that we had, that there were many companies in India before Section 135 that were already spending a lot more than 2% of their profits. And then after Section 135, they lowered their CSR expenditures. And it's not one or two companies, there were several hundred companies that did that.
Then we'll move to Rajneesh Kumar. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
It was a wonderful presentation and very relevant, particularly the expenditure coming down after introduction of Section 135 is a very interesting fact. But my question is that there is this debate about development and versus how do you become environmentally responsible. And this is a debate where like India, China, sometimes they are on the one side and the developed is that in countries, they have this aspiration, no? And that would mean that consumption would increase of everything. So realistically, how is it possible for developing countries like India who have aspirations to ensure that they remain environmentally responsible?
So that's an excellent question. What I heard from you was the concern that in developing countries, and that issue also applies to developed countries, that there is a trade-off between environment and the jobs. So jobs meaning most jobs, especially in developing countries, that comes from manufacturing. So most manufacturing related jobs do require power of some kind. Power generation in most parts of the world, including India, is based, at least a majority of that power source comes from coal and gas and oil in some other countries. So if you're going to, if your aspiration is to create more manufacturing jobs, there has to be a trade-off with regard to carbon emissions. Now, when electric power is generated from coal or gas, there are ways to mitigate the carbon emission. You can sequester the carbon, or so those technologies are all very fine and should be encouraged, and we should also encourage solar and wind. But currently, where the world stands is 60% of the global energy, comes from coal and oil and gas. And there are estimates from United Nations, various agencies, and various energy agencies across the world that over the next 50 years, in spite of all the advances we've made with wind and solar, and we should continue to make advances, continue to focus on R&D on wind and solar, they are not going to provide even half of the energy needs of the world. So where will that energy come from? And the obvious answer is, it's got to be from coal, oil, gas. Nuclear is also fine. But that's the debate that most people in conferences, and especially in Davos, Switzerland, and you have the other World Economic Forum conferences. You had the one in Glasgow, in Paris, and I think they'll be having another one somewhere, where you have leaders and other people in various leadership capacities across the world meet and talk about the concerns about environment. The concerns about the environment is something I can empathize with, but I don't hear the same concern about jobs for the people in developing countries and even developed countries. I don't hear the same concern that there is this very strong relationship, as I showed you in that graph. And incidentally, all these slides, I've requested the organizers of this webinar to make it available to the audience, so you should get access to all the slides. And what I was in that graph, what I was showing is that the quality of human life, especially in developing countries, is very positively correlated with the amount of electrical energy that they consume. So there's also that issue that if you have a very strong focus on cutting down on carbon emissions, meaning less electricity, the price of electricity goes up. If the price of electricity goes up, the people in the lowest rungs of the income ladder, the underprivileged people in the society, their lives are made a lot more difficult. That issue doesn't get enough of a discussion. So I think I very much relate to your concerns, and I wish that the ESG conferences had more of a balanced focus. All that notwithstanding, I think we should continue to sort of do research and implement carbon sequestration, trying to sequester carbon that gets emitted, in ways that it doesn't negatively impact the environment. And then also
one more follow-up question, just for clarification, possibly, if you don't mind. When you have drawn that pie chart about the sources of the energy, 29% solar and 58%, is it based on the what is called PLF, plant load factor, or installed capacity? Because solar 100 megawatt is not the same as 100 megawatt of fossil fuel. There the plant load factor would be 85%. So we are producing 80 megawatt. And in solar, plant load factor would be 22 or 25%. So when we say 100 megawatt of solar and 100 megawatt of fossil fuel, actually the plant load factor, if we take, then the ratio would be very different. So that is one thing I thought that I should bring it to your attention, as well as try to get an answer.
Yeah, so I looked at that data from the Ministry of Power. So I kind of have the website here located, and I made the pie chart, but that pie chart is made on the basis of the data that the Ministry of Power has on their website. Yeah. And I know that they did talk about, load factor and so forth, but my understanding is that this is the power that gets generated. So what is the original source of that power?
Okay. If it is the power generated, then it is all right. If it is the installed capacity, then this distorts the picture. So that is something I will also try to do some research on this. Thank you very much.
So we will take one more question by Lakshmikant Srivastava. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Very good morning, Doctor. You have elaborated the ESG impact, financial impact of the ESG. I can make out that inverse relationship is there between the financials and the ESG so far until the awareness is going in the market, and like stock markets are not very happy with the five globe companies. So a lot of education, a lot of sensitivity is required, and in that jobs are reducing when the companies are implementing the ESG, or development is taking place and ESG is there, but somewhere environment is getting affected by the development. Here recently what happens in Uttarakhand, in Joshimath, a lot of cracks had come in walls and streets, etc. And it is being said that the development has taken manifold. That maybe the unbearable, that cliff has not got that bearing capacity. That is why it has collapsed. So what my concern is that how we have to make the trade-off, how we have to go for that. That our capital market should also accept the ESG, and government should also accept. And one thing you will appreciate, that the government is very much towards the ESG, like 135, section 135 has been implemented. Like from the next year, regulatory disclosure has to be done by certain companies, and so many things are there for the ESG, and independent directors are also being inducted. So I need that the inverse relationship should not be there. At least our financial sector should accept it, and five globe companies like good rating ESG companies, bonds, etc. should go in a good market, should have the good market value. How we will be achieving this?
So I think, sir, your question is a good one, and I think the concerns you raised are very valid. I mean, we have to be concerned about the environment in communities that the company is operating in, and the climate of the whole globe that can be negatively. There is debate about how much carbon emission negatively impacts the climate, but that's a separate discussion. But let's say carbon emission has a negative impact on climate, so we have to be concerned about that. I'm not saying that managers, companies should not be concerned about it. For example, if a company acquires a reputation of really being negative on the environment, meaning their plants engage in a lot of pollution that negatively impacts the health of the communities in which the plants have been located, then one, the health of the employees goes down. So if employees don't have good health, they cannot work well. Additionally, if people get to know that the area where the company is located, you cannot live there, then the company may have a hard time even attracting good employees. So companies have to be focused on the environment, even if they are concerned on creating shareholder value, or even if they're just focused on their own operations, even if they're just concerned about producing their product and selling it, they cannot ignore the environment. And that's where the shareholder maximization idea of looking at all of these things. So environment is very much in here, but environment is looked at through the prism of shareholder value. If you look at environment individually, then there is no guidance to managers as to, essentially, if you start taking this idea of stakeholderism literally, then short of outright fraud, CEOs, managing directors, they could spend money on anything they wanted to without any accountability. Because they can always say, look, we spent this money because we wanted to improve healthcare of a community. We spent this money because we wanted better schools. We spent this money. I mean, they can do anything. And if companies start spending money without any accountability, very soon that company will not be around, along with the loss of jobs and the drop in the GDP. So you have to look at it in a larger context. that if you say that managers have to be just concerned about all of these stakeholder issues without any sense of how to measure them or how to weight them, then basically you're giving the manager the free license, the managing director the free license to spend the money on whatever they wanted and not be held accountable. And if that's the case, then you'll have negative impact on jobs in that state, negative impact on communities. You'll have a negative impact on the nation's GDP. So those are the other side of the coin.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for the question. Due to some technical glitch, Dr. Neeraj Gupta is unable to say the word of thanks. So, on behalf of the center, I would like to thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And there are a lot of insights, and there are certain, there will be definitely a change in the way we perceive things. For example, for the ID data bank members and for the center, for the research that we do and for the courses that we develop, these are very informative. And sir, we have already shared the presentation to the ID data bank members. And thank you once again. Thank you for your time and your effort to come here and address our data bank members. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you for this opportunity. Good evening.